So let's go ahead and output the page that we currently clicked on in here by using the slug in the URL to lift this from the database and then go ahead and output it to the user. So at the moment we can just see page here. We're going to do a very similar thing that we did on the home view. Remember, we have this home view here by outputting a header and a footer. But let's first of all just write the PHP that we need to actually pull this record out. So the first thing that we want to do then is require in app start.php. Remember, that's the file that contains our database connection and any of our global variables that we've created. And the first thing we want to do is check if the page key here is set in the query string. And if it isn't, we want to set the page to false, just so we can check that in our view. So let's create an if statement just here. We're going to check if something is empty, and that is $_get, which is a get super global, which will contain all of the values sent in the query string. And we're going to check if page is empty. If page is empty, we're going to set page to false. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and grab the page, and that page will be the value that we passed in. So for now, let's just do a var dump on $_get, our get super global, and let's just see what this looks like. So you can see here we've got an array with one element, the key is page, and the value is a string first page. And again, if that was second page, we would see this update accordingly. So now that we know what data we're working with, we can go ahead and create our query. But I'm going to store here first of all the slug, which is basically just what we saw a moment ago. So now we can create our query, and we're going to do this slightly differently by using a prepared statement. So all this means is we're going to create a query, which isn't going to run straight away until we execute it, but we're going to create a placeholder for the slug. And the reason that we do this is because this is user controlled data. The user can change this to whatever they want to. So that means that we're vulnerable to SQL injection if we just put it into a query, and that can have very bad security implications on your database. So let's create a variable called page and assign to it a database prepared statement. So in here again, we do exactly the same as we did for the home page. We have a string with a query in. This time we're going to select all fields because we're going to need them all. And we're doing this from the pages table. But this time we have a where clause, and this is going to allow us to pick out this value. So we're going to say where slug equals, now ordinarily you'd have something where slug equals first page. And that's going to go ahead and bring back only this record. And then the same if it was second page or any other slug, you would see that. But we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to create a placeholder, and that involves a colon and then the name of the placeholder. So at the moment the query has not been run. We need to execute it, and we need to decide which value replaces this value here. We already know that that's the slug up here. So let's say page execute, and inside of here we pass an array. And the key to the array is the name of the placeholder, so it must match this here. So in this case it's slug, and to that we assign the value slug, which we get from up here. So now that has run the query, and we can go ahead and pull the result back. So to do this, I'm just going to say page, and I'm going to assign page fetch. We don't need to fetch all here because remember, we're only pulling back one result. We could even demonstrate this by saying limit 1, because we only ever want one result back from this. But to fetch it as an associative array, we do the same thing. We say PDO and then this static fetch assoc. So let's do a quick var dump on page, just so we can see the result of that. Let's refresh, and now you can see we get an array of 7. That's the ID, label, etc., etc. So all of the fields from that database table and that row. So again, we can choose second page if we want, and we see this. And you can obviously see at this point, we can click this and we get this information. We click this and we get this information. So we're nicely tying it up now. We're just not outputting it to the user just yet. So let's go ahead and do that now. And then we're going to return to look at how we can modify the dates so we can actually output the dates in a nice format. So we need to create the view for showing a page. So inside views, I'm going to create a new folder to store anything related to pages. So I'm just going to call that page. And inside of here, I'm going to create a new file called show.php. This is going to be our show. So show page. So let's require in view root, much like we did on the home page, and then / page show.php. So the path to that file. And now when we see this page, we see show page and show page. So let's click on first page and we'll start to see all this information come out. So on show.php, this templating works in exactly the same way as home. So we can copy this and we can paste it into here. And we can do the same for our footer as well. We don't need to retype these. And now in here, we want to output the actual page information. So the first thing that we want to do then is check if the page was actually found or not. Remember, we set this to false if the query string was empty. And also the query will return false if it can't find this page as well. So we've got a false value if it can't be found either way. So we say if not page, or we could say if page equals false. We want our else here. And then we want our end if. So if the page cannot be found or there's no slug provided, we want to say no, page found, sorry. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and output our page. So remember, we have this page variable that we can work with here. So I'm going to create an h2, and inside of here, I'm going to echo page title. So let's see what that looks like. There we go. So we've got my CMS because we included the header and the footer, and there is the text for our first page. Let's go back and just click on second page, and we can see this is the second page. So it's already starting to come together. Now, before we go any further, we want to talk about security. Because what we're doing here is we're outputting values from our database table without escaping this value. And by escaping, I basically mean converting special characters like double and single quotes to HTML entities. Now, that might sound a little bit confusing, but let's take a look at why we might want to do this. So let's head over to the first page. You can see the titles there. And you might think, well, I control all of this database data, so it doesn't really matter. But if anyone was to gain access to your database, for example, what they could do is go ahead and enter something like a script tag, which can have bad implications in terms of things like XSS attacks. We won't go into that too much, but you just need to know that it's pretty bad. So we've got a script in here that's just alerting out the value 1. So when I go ahead and refresh here, you can actually see that we get this output. And this isn't good because it means that we're allowing code from our database that we're outputting to run JavaScript. So let's just go ahead and start to implement a way to escape data on the way out. So inside of app, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be called functions.php. It's just going to store some functions. We're just going to have one in here. So we have function, and we're going to call this E for escape. You can call it escape if you want to be more explicit. And inside of this, we want to pass in some text. So this is the argument that we want to be able to pass in. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a PHP function called HTML special chars. And all this is going to do is it's going to convert any special characters to HTML entities, which will mean that they can't be executed. So scripts won't be able to be executed. You'll just see them on the page. and we'll see how this works in a moment. So we want to return the result of HTML special chars. In here we pass in the text that we want to escape, and then what we do is we pass in the level of escaping. So for me, I'm just going to say end quotes. You can look this up on the PHP manual to find out the different levels of escaping if you do come across any problems. So the last is going to be the character encoding, and I'm going to set this to UTF-8 because what I've done is, if you didn't notice before, inside of the template in the header, the page char set or character encoding is UTF-8. So all this means is that we're matching the escaping here to the character encoding of our page. So now what we can do is we can wrap this or anything we want to sanitize or escape rather in this E function. So on show, we can go ahead and wrap this like that. So it's a pretty easy function to use, but you know then you're protecting against XSS attacks. So let's view the page source of this just to see what this looks like at the moment. It's just a script tag which the browser will interpret as a JavaScript tag, and it will go ahead and execute this code, but we don't want that. So let's go ahead and put in our E function again. So remember, we're passing this value into the E function, and then it's going ahead and returning the escaped output. Now when I refresh, we obviously need to include this somewhere in our code. So inside of start.php, we can require in functions.php, and then we won't see this call to undefined function error. And now you can actually see the code being output, and this isn't a problem because if we look at the page source again, you can see that the greater than and less than signs here have been converted to entities, which mean they are not interpreted as script tags, they're interpreted as actual characters which can be output to the page. So we can use this for any data we go ahead and output to the page, and we know that we are just making this a little bit more secure. So let's go ahead and just get rid of this for now. We know how that works and that's all done. And let's carry on with the rest of this page. So let's head over to show. The next thing that we want to output is the body. So let's go ahead and echo out E, and inside of E we're going to pass in page body. So we now have the body of our page, and we are going to output the created and updated dates too. But we're going to modify these slightly, because what we're not doing is we're not returning these as DateTime objects that we can modify in the way that we want. At the moment, they're just stored as strings in our database. So if we try to manipulate this in any way, it's not going to work. So just under here then, I'm going to modify the original array that's been returned. And I'm going to check if the page has been found first of all, because we don't want to modify anything if the page has not been found. And we're going to say page access the created column, and we're going to reassign this a new DateTime object. And all we do here is we pass in page created, and instead of a string, we now have a DateTime object inside of this created key. And all that means is we can use the functionality around DateTime to manipulate the dates in the way that we want, format them in the way that we want, and things like that. So we can also go ahead and do updated as well, but we need to check that the updated date isn't null. So in this case, we can just say if page updated. So if there is a date inside of our updated column, we can go ahead and do exactly the same as we did here to that. So I can just copy and paste this, change that to updated, and change that to updated as well. So there are a lot more efficient ways to do this, but for now this is just a good example of how we can use date times instead of strings inside of our dates, so we can output them in the way we want. So this hasn't changed anything at all, but now we can start to look at outputting the date just down here. So we have a class called faded. We're going to be including all of this inside of a paragraph. So we can assign this the class faded, and that's just inside of app.css. If you want to take a look at that, you got color BBB. So that's all we're doing for that. So now inside of here, we want to say created on, and let's just try and output that DateTime object. So what we would normally do in this situation is say echo page created, and let's see what happens just here. So you can see here, created catchable fatal error, object of class DateTime could not be converted to a string. All that means is we're trying to echo out an object, and we can only echo out things like integers, strings, anything that can be just immediately seen. We can't echo out an object. But what we can do is, because this is now an object, we can go ahead and use the format method to choose the format that we want to output this in. So I'm going to choose JS. This is just going to output the date, and then this TH or ST, depending on the day of the month. Then we have the month and then the year. So that's just capital M, capital Y. When we refresh, we see that. So you can chop and change this around. If you just wanted D like that, for example, you'd get that out. It's entirely up to you what you do now, but now you've got the flexibility to do this. So what we want to do then is, I'm just going to pull this down to make it a little bit easier to read. And we want to check if the page has been updated or not. So inside of here, we can create an if statement. And we're going to say if page updated. So we're still, again, we're checking if that is null. Because if it isn't updated, we don't want to output a formatted date, because it won't work, because we will have a null value just in here. So we're going to say last updated, and then we can just go ahead, I guess, and copy this, paste that in there. So we have the same format. We just need to change the key that we access here. So at the moment, this isn't going to show us this. It's just created on. But let's manually add in an updated date just to see that this works. And let's refresh, and there we go. So last updated 16th of May, whatever. We can even go and add in things like the hours, the minutes, and then whether it's A or PM, like so. So 0:31 AM. Okay, so let's just get rid of updated. Let's add capital null in there to null that field again. That just gets rid of that. And that is it for our CMS page. We can click on second page and see the information about the second page. So we've come a long way from the start in the fact that we've listed out our pages. We can click into that and we can see the contents of our page. The next thing we're going to look at is adding pages through our kind of admin panel, which, remember, is this protected folder just here with our htaccess and our htpassword.